my computer. Okay, we're good.
All right, well, welcome everyone, those who are here live and those who may be watching this at a later time. Last time we did several practices to help to begin to awaken what are sometimes called the subtle senses of perception, inner sight, inner hearing, and so on. And so we'll start with just a little taste of another very useful practice, and this is one working with what we might call degrees of presence. And that's probably not something that you've thought much about before. I mean, we think of presence, you're either here or you're not here, but we've all had the experiences of being physically present to something, but our minds were somewhere else, or our emotions were caught up in something, and so we weren't really bringing all of our being to that. So one important ingredient in awakening in the spiritual journey is to learn how to really be fully present to whatever it is that you're tuning into or experiencing, whether it's in the outer manifestation, which could be another person, could be connecting with an experience in nature, or whether it's tuning into inner realms or subtle realms. And this requires some training. Usually the first step is to develop concentration, and we're not going to do concentration exercises, but it's very important to develop this faculty, because our tendency is to want to get to very esoteric kinds of practices and not go through basic training, so to speak. And we might think, well, I don't need to learn how to concentrate. Sure, I can do that. But if most of us were to write down our thoughts on the fly for a period of a couple of minutes and then show them to somebody else, they would kind of wonder about it, right? Because our minds tend to wander all over the place, and it's quite challenging to really be able to hold focus on anything for any length of time. But this is a really important ingredient to be able to experience expanded states of consciousness. But just a basic way of beginning and working to work with presence is to just start with where you are and allow yourself to become aware of your physical being. Just your body sitting wherever you are, how it feels with what you're sitting on, the temperature of the room, being aware of any sounds that might be present around you, what you see around you, and just try to tune into just this. And if your mind starts thinking about other things, just gently bring it back. So let's begin with that. As Ram Dass said many, many years ago, be here now. Your breathing can be a real help in this process of just being aware of the air coming in and the air coming out, and the circulation of energy that happens with each breath, as we have experienced in some of our earlier sessions of this webinar. Now allow yourself to continue being present physically, and add on, be present mentally. Bring your attention, your thoughts, without necessarily having any content to them. It's just an openness of mind, imagining like a vast blue sky. So you're open to discovery, to experience, without any preconceptions, without latching on to thoughts of the past or anticipations of the future. And now continue to be physically present and mentally present, and add on being emotionally present. So whatever emotions might be stirring around, whether they're excitement or sadness or frustration or whatever might be there, just allow your heart to feel open and not let yourself get caught up in any particular emotion that is trying to grab your awareness. So once again, you're opening to a state of receptivity, physical receptivity, mental receptivity, emotional receptivity, independent of any particular content. And now let's add on another dimension, and this would be becoming present spiritually to aspects of your being that are beyond what you're normally aware of in physical space and time, but the transcendent aspects of your being that the mystics say exist beyond space and time, and the physicists would say that there's many, many dimensions that everything really has an existence in, and we're normally only conscious of 3 of space and 1 of time, but the other ones are all co-present. So opening up to deeper possibilities, even beyond what we can conceive of with our ordinary ways of thinking. And this is another way of thinking about enabling the connection between subtle levels of reality and ordinary reality that brings about a transformation in everything that you're experiencing. It literally transforms the space that you exist in, so that there's now more degrees of freedom. So this state of presence is a precursor to developing what we might call multimodal awareness. This is realizing that we are beings that exist in many realms simultaneously, and to be able to experience first of all, it feels like a circulation, because our minds tend to think in that way, like something going up and something coming back down. And that's a useful starting point. So there's a circulation of energy between these realms. But with practice and with a further development of the ability to awaken these subtle organs of perception, we can experience ourselves as a united being existing in multiple realms simultaneously. And so all of these are going on at the same time, and every part is having an impact on every other part. Although language doesn't allow us to really describe this phenomenon, because you have to talk one word after another, and we're not used to thinking of something where everything is affecting everything else all of the time. But that's really what's going on. You might say everything is updating everything else all of the time. And so we can live in that fresh awareness that the Sufis describe as there being a new creation that's born at every instant. And the physicists would say, where they talk about the smallest unit of time, the Planck unit of time, and a shorter unit of time beyond that, it's not even meaningful to talk about time, but time is not continuous. There's these discrete, infinitesimally small intervals of time. And so it really is that there's a newness that is at every fraction of an instant, but our perception causes us to just bring forward into the next moment a projection of the way that we assume that things were and the way that we assume things will be. And this is all happening below the level of conscious thinking. We don't sit and think, well, let's see, I think there's going to be a little bit more change from how they were. It's just the way that we're wired. It's our conditioning that causes us to operate like that. But when we can step into this other richer modality of consciousness, now there's possibilities of what can emerge all of the time, that we're not stuck with just a continuation of what's been before. So many of you are probably familiar with the term karma, People say, oh, that was bad karma, or it was good karma, this happened. And karma is almost always described as kind of like a debt that you have to pay. All the things that you've done, you've got to burn off that karma before you can be free. And so sometimes the explanation when something bad happens, well, this must be, sometimes people think, well, maybe something happened in a past life or who knows what. But a very different way of thinking about it is that karma is what you get if you don't discover how to free yourself from that conditioned perspective of your own existence in relationship to everything else. You're stuck with that, and that's what's going to happen. The patterns will repeat unless you can free yourself from that. And that's quite challenging to do because the tendency is for us to identify very strongly with our history and the way that things have been. And, you know, people say things like, well, I can't really do anything about it. I'm just a person who, and then you fill in the blank. Or I always this, or I never that, without realizing that's just the programming that's happened up to now, but that doesn't have to continue into the future. And one very valuable function of spiritual awakening is that we can learn to free ourselves from this conditioning of the past. And in the spiritual terminology, we could say that we now are no longer bound by the consequences of the actions that we did in the past. Now, that doesn't mean you can go around doing whatever you want and nothing's going to happen to you. That's not what I'm saying. But we're not stuck with the same patterning repeating itself. We can free ourselves from that. We can very much change our perspective, our vantage point, and our basic sense of identity in terms of how we relate to everything else. Okay, so let that just kind of sink in for a bit, and maybe take a moment and think about patterns in your own life that have just tended to repeat themselves many, many times. But also think about when that happened in the past and then something happened that freed you from that chain of causality. It's like, well, no, that no longer applied anymore. Something freed you from that. Maybe it was something traumatic, or maybe it was something very wonderful, but something got you off that causal chain. So the teacher that I studied with in the Sufi order for many, many years, Pir Balayat, would talk about instead of a causality-driven sense of existence and spirituality, instead of that, there can be a purpose-oriented way of viewing spirituality and our way of being in the world. And then that's kind of continually taking a look at, well, what is or what can be the purpose of what's emerging right now in my life? And that can include how we relate to a difficulty that's going on. Instead of thinking, well, if only this situation would just go away, then I could be free. Now I could meditate, but I can't possibly meditate because all of this stuff is going on. Well, a very different way of looking at that would be asking yourself, what is it that's seeking to emerge in my being by finding a different way to relate to the situation that in the past I would have always tended to deal with in such and such a way? And what happens if I do something very different? And some ways to begin to see things in a different light. One useful one is to ask yourself, well, if I could imagine somebody that I know, some great person that could be in history or present day, if they were in this situation, they'd know what to do, and you visualize what they would do in that situation. And it's probably not too hard to imagine that. We probably could almost always think of somebody that would be really good at this, even if we think, well, I don't have any of that in me, I couldn't do that. But then we could imagine that if I were that person, what would it feel like to kind of act like you're doing a role in a play, and now you're acting like this person would. You're just imagining that. But then gradually you try that on for size and go, well, let me see what would happen if I really put this to the test in this situation. And many times we discover the way we relate to it changes dramatically, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the external situation is going to change one bit. But instead of something that trapped us even further, now the same situation becomes something that furthers our awakening. Big difference. And if we can get to that with many or most of the situations that we tend to react to in our life, our whole life will change. If I could give somebody one spiritual tip, I think it would be that. Do that. You'll come out way ahead. And we're all capable of doing that. But so often we don't realize that there's other choices on the menu, so to speak. We don't think about it. We just go with the way that we've done things in the past, and then we think about, oh, here I go again, or here this happens again. Spirituality has been described in a very basic way by the person who brought Sufism to the West in the early 1900s, Hazrat Inayat Khan. He said spirituality is a matter of changing one's point of view. Now that's a lot less glitzy than achieving the highest state of enlightenment or going to the beyond or so on, but it really is about changing our perspective. And if we can change our point of view in just the simple situations that go on in our life, with practice we can develop these subtle senses and we can change our perspective cosmically and in the many dimensions in which we experience. And this is what awakening is about. It's not awakening to something that's never been. It's awakening to potentialities that have always been there, but they haven't been activated. First of all, because we didn't even know that they were there. And even if we believe someone else's description, well, they're there, we thought, well, I couldn't possibly do that. And even if we think, well, maybe someday I'll learn how to do that, we don't try different methodologies that have been time tested over the centuries and develop the skills necessary to be able to orient ourselves in those different states of consciousness. Because it's not the same, may sound kind of strange, it's not the same modality of consciousness that we go around in our day-to-day lives that's going to enable us to be able to make any sense out of and relate to more subtle states of consciousness. They're just like there's overtones in music and there's frequencies we can't hear and there's frequencies of light that we can't see. This is like becoming capable of perceiving things on a much more subtle level that are possibilities of our being, but they've all been scotch taped over, so they haven't been activated. So let me pause here for a little bit and see if anybody has any comments or questions about anything I've said so far. Does this resonate with anything? Yes, Lee.
Talk about having somebody.
A little bit louder, please.
When you talk about having somebody that we admire, in a way, we are tuning into their frequency, are we not? I mean, we're resonating with their vibration, and so it's not only a transmission of thought. I mean, it's a vibration that we're tuning into.
Well, that is an excellent point. Yeah, it isn't like we're sitting here and they're up on high and then they're dispensing some Zappo thing down to us. We couldn't have that experience unless we were able to, you could say, harmonize, the Sufis would say, harmonize our attunement with that being, so there is a resonance with them. But we can't experience anything in another being unless we have that aspect available in our own being. It just wouldn't take. But our tendency is to think, well, this person's got it and I don't, so I just want to hang around them, so maybe a little bit will spill off into me, instead of realizing my experience around this being, who's probably developed the capacity of linking up subtle reality with the ordinary, so now it becomes a lot easier in the space around them to experience this. But what you're experiencing then is you have opened up to a deeper level of your own being, who's now able to experience a possibility that you didn't realize was there. And you can do this. It isn't just, it's not anything that's particular to anybody, any great or holy being, although they certainly have developed naturally or through their own development this capability much more so than the typical person. So I'm glad you raised that point. So this is one take home from these 4 sessions that would be a good keeper. Any amazing experience you've had, whether it's been in your own internal meditations or with some other great being or whatever, you could not have had that experience unless you have at least temporarily activated something that has always been present in you. You just didn't know how to do it before. And this is a good segue into some principles that the Sufis talk about called fana, F-A-N-A, and baqa, B-A-Q-A. Fana literally means, well, the old term translation is annihilation or shattering, and baqa means rebirth or resurrection. But what does this mean? It's similar to what happens in self-organization and chaos theory. In a chaotic system, there's the initial conditions, and then the in-between state is just you don't know what's going to come out of it. But then the final state is at a higher level of organization than the starting point. Well, this is happening. This is an inherent quality of life itself. Life is always trying to self-organize to a higher state of being. And we could say that if you believe in the idea of the soul, our souls are always trying to organize experience in different realms, including the physical realm, to higher degrees of awakening where more possibilities of consciousness are manifest. Well, what has to happen for that to occur, it is not a linear process. It's not just a little more of this. It's not just like a line or solid curve. It's got discontinuities. So there's a usual way of being, and the Sufis talk about a station that we're in, maqam, M-A-Q-A-M, and you don't have to remember these terms, but so our station is kind of like the way that we've been, the lessons that we've been dealing with, what we've learned, what's worked so far, and so on. And we exist in one of these, but then it's the nature of our deeper self to want to organize to a higher level. And so now what was working starts not to work anymore because something new is trying to come through. And out of a desire for security, we tend to just dig in and trying to repeat even more strongly what has worked so far in the past but isn't working anymore, and things start falling apart more and more. And you probably can think of periods in your life like this. If we're able to let go, and even though we don't know exactly how things are going to go, but have a trust that something is trying to develop, it's kind of like the caterpillar in the chrysalis, it's liquefied, and then it turns into the butterfly. You could never predict the butterfly from the liquefied chrysalis, but that's the process that's going on. And then the baqa, that's the new emergence. That's the new life that emerges from that. All of us have probably been through stations and stages in our life where there's been this breakdown of the old way, a period of reorganization, and then we enter a new station. Now we're able to deal with things on a higher order of functioning. And we might think, okay, that's good. I'll just stay here for the rest of my days. Nope. There's no end to it. There's always a continuation of letting go and organizing to an even higher state than that. And I'd say, thank goodness there's no end point, because if there were, that, what else would there be after that? I think things would be pretty boring. And I believe everything in existence is moving towards a greater capacity for what can come through. I've talked before about Seth Lloyd's theory that the universe is a giant quantum computer and it's trying to compute itself. Well, and I've mentioned the Sufis say the creation happened because the divine being said, I was a hidden treasure desiring to be known. And however you look at it, things seem to be unfolding towards greater capacities of consciousness, and what greater capacities of what is now possible in manifestation in its relationship with everything that's more subtle than manifestation. Because if you don't continue to have these linkages between subtle and manifest, even though it becomes much more subtle than it was before, and even the manifestation is more subtle than it was before, if you didn't continue to have this bridging, then things would just stop. But they don't. They continue to go on and on. And what we can do, which is pretty wonderful, is we can develop the capacity to consciously participate in this process, not only in our own evolution, which is wonderful, but to me, much more wonderful than that is we are participating in the unfoldment of everything, with a capital E, everything, whether you call it the divine or the transcendent, or the physicists might call it the relationship between the 0-point field and the existence. Doesn't matter what you call it, but there's always this twofold relationship going on that we can enhance our ability to participate in. So to me, that's a pretty wonderful and amazing reason to do spiritual practices. It is not the way that I certainly thought it was on the start of my journey. I just wanted to get there. I wanted to get enlightened. And, you know, most of us start on the journey like we want to become like the Buddha or like Christ or whatever. And those are wonderful ideals, but there's more than that. We, you know, like Christ said to his followers, each of you can do what I did and even more. That the part usually gets left out in the sermons, at least a lot of the time, that each of us, as I mentioned before, has a potentiality that could never come through anything in the whole universe, past, present, or future, except through us. And so the value of uniqueness in ourselves in unfolding this process. So other comments or questions at this point? Yes. Doug, did you?
Yeah, I had a comment. I think one of the things that has been surfacing for me here is the idea of human centricity, and that in many ways, human centricity, being in this human organism, this human body, comes with certain baggage by being human. And one of those elements of baggage could be duality, being prone to conditioning, etc., etc. So this being human, in many ways, limits me from seeing that which is greater than being this one human organism. And so I think what you just said really clicked with me is at the same time, however, we have this unique gift to consciously choose to say, how do I learn to expand or open beyond this human centricity, which then allows me to perceive and experience this multidimensional existence in which we all live. And so I do think it really is that realization of both being bound and being limited, and then making that conscious choice to say, how do I get beyond my human centricity into greater realms?
Yeah. So Pure Light would sometimes talk about our beings are infinite at one end, transcendent, and finite down to the human and our bodies. But there has to be this limitation in order for anything to happen, because you couldn't have a relationship with the infinite relating to the infinite. And because the consciousness of most people is solely on that just very limited far end of the line, you could say, so to speak, that illusory limitation on who we are cuts off the possibilities of so much that could be happening. So I would say that what gets transcended is the you said human centricity. I'd say dualistic icity. That we are caught in a very powerful belief that we are all separated beings, and we're separated even from the aim of what our spiritual journey is about. That if we think it's God, God is very far away. If we think it's some transcendent realm in Buddhism, that's so far away from where I am. And then we're trying to think, well, how on earth am I going to get this lump of clay over here over to there? Well, you're not. You can't get this there. This body and all our physical senses, Pure Light would say, that's our spacesuit for experiencing the conditions of planet Earth. The external part of ourselves, which is very sacred, but it's not what is going to be capable of experiencing these subtle realms. We have to develop these subtle senses to be able to get there. We can't catapult our normal, or not normal, typical consciousness into these other realms. It doesn't work. It won't get there. And what used to happen and I guess probably still happens sometimes, is some people have, whether it's through drugs or as a spontaneous mystical experience, got opened up to a state of consciousness that they weren't able to deal with in any way because they hadn't established the bridge between the physical and that. So they sometimes would become dysfunctional and end up in psychiatric hospitals. So we don't want that. We want to have a continuity in the midst of the discontinuity between these different levels of consciousness. We want to have a firm sense of identity that ultimately becomes even independent of whatever form our consciousness is functioning through, whether it's in this realm or a more subtle realm. So I'm glad you mentioned that. So the spirituality for centuries, the goal has been, and there's different names in different systems, heaven, mukti, moksha, liberation, salvation. And instead of that, and that implies some kind of finish line, whatever you call it, instead of that, ask ourselves, what does it mean to be a conscious part of a cosmic neural network in which every part is interconnected with every other part? And what does it mean to consciously participate in that? And we can never take the whole thing in all at once. I mean, the circuits would be blown if we attempted to do that. So we can modulate our consciousness. And I would say another way of describing that is we can modulate our modality of relationship between our vantage point and whatever it is that we're experiencing. And we can modulate it in such a way that it's not dualistic and it's not merged. It's not, we're gone, we've totally disappeared. It's what I term relational unity. We're now in this very permeable state of experience with something else. It's a very deep, you could say it's a communion. Communion implies there's two things, there's two parts going on there. And in that state, the mystics say, I talked about presence at the start of this webinar tonight. In this state, there's the mystics say a third presence, a new presence arises that is something beyond anything that could have occurred solely between either of the two parts of this. So if this is an experience we're having with another person, something arises in this degree of relationship, and now perhaps we have ideas that neither one could have possibly come up with on their own, and we have insights and understandings because now there's this kind of cross-pollination of the uniqueness of each being kind of circulating with each other, and now something can come out that couldn't have come out otherwise. And this can happen with two people, this can happen with a group with a common intention. And I mentioned, I think at the very start of these 4 sessions, I really believe that the only way the long-standing, most serious problems of humanity are ever going to be solved is when more and more people develop this capacity of consciousness and be able to network with each other in this way that now this linkage of the subtle and the manifest, and this linkage of different presences with each other, and the linkage of the different unique wisdom of different beings is now interplaying with each other. And now there's going to be solutions that become evident that never would have happened by, no matter how brilliant and how many people you have functioning in a separated state of consciousness. So to me, that maybe is the ultimate positive reason for developing spiritual awakening. It's not something, and some of you watched the first series I did back in February, which is on YouTube. It's called Spiritual Awakening as Service to the World. And that's what that was about, that we really can literally bring about a transformation of the world, and the world being much more than the physical world that we usually think of it as, by this development of this kind of consciousness. So let me take a breath here and see if you have any questions about that or thoughts. Or have circuits been blown?
Well, being a little bit shy here, I really like that concept of having a what did you say? Being part of a universal neural network. And that truly is a mind expanding, mind boggling perspective of existence that, that it is much greater than this infinite organism called Doug in Washington State. And that really is something I'll have to wrestle with and see how I can make it part of my view of life and the world. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, some physicists postulate that the quantum vacuum contains, because everything is deeply interconnected with everything else, that it contains the potentials of all the information that there is, period. And I think this would be the physics version of the Akashic record, although the way the Akashic record is usually described is it's as if it's this static cosmic library that everything is just sitting there and you could see everything that was going to happen or did happen. And I don't believe that at all. I think it's always being updated by the evolution of everything in existence. It's being changed.
Yeah,
yeah.
Oh, I guess I would just jump in, and because just where you put it there is kind of how the connection feels to me. That it's not just kind of the neural network, it's just the whole being network, and it's my relationship to the grass outside and the mosquito outside and the birds outside and the whole thing. And for me, the draw is less what we're doing as humans, which is certainly a part of it, but how we are together with all beings.
Oh, I'm glad you said it. Absolutely. This applies to this neural network, is everything is interconnected with everything else. And in a neural network, you have the different nodes, kind of focal points, and we can become conscious nodes in this cosmic neural network. And everything is a part of this, but some parts have got a lesser capacity for awareness and consciousness than others, but everything is a part of all the rest of it, and everything is affected by everything else that's in that. I recently finished reading a book called something like The Hidden Life of Trees or The Secret Life of Trees, which is just amazing, talking about like the mother trees nurturing their offspring and preventing them from growing too fast so they'll survive high winds later after the mother tree is long gone, and how trees can communicate through chemicals if there's some insects that's eating one. I mean, just the world is so much more alive than we think of it as. Nature is not just some pretty inanimate sort of thing. And animals, I mean, anybody that has a pet, we have a little blue-crowned conure that excuse me, has amazing intelligence and awareness and consciousness, and sometimes I think she maybe understands things more than we do. But yeah, this isn't limited to humans, but Hazrat Khan said of human beings that we're the only being in the universe that has its existence in every realm of existence. So that means that we have a potentiality for a capacity to come through that perhaps is more than what's possible through many other parts of this cosmic neural network, but every part is relevant and important.
Well, the universe is such a big place that, personally, I don't know how I would conclude, the state of my being in the universe. You were quoting someone who feels that we're unique in the universe.
Well, I think in his time, it would be on Earth, and I'm sure that he would say that there's got to be other life forms that probably evolved far beyond us that the same would be true of. I mean, beings that have enabled a certain degree of consciousness and capacity for participation in the totality, the same would apply for them. So I don't think it would be particular to just human beings. Good point. So these are
you know, one of the things that you mentioned was the idea of nodes as in a neural network. And what that reminds me of is the idea of knots in like a net, a fishing net. And, you know, the Hindus talk about Indra's net as the universe. And, you know, I think Alan Watts used to talk about the fact that a net is a bunch of holes tied together. And so I wonder about the space, and some now are talking about dark matter. So we're focusing on the object of our attention. What about that which is behind the object? Space, darkness, dark matter. So I'd like you to maybe give us your thoughts on some of that.
Wow, that's that's quite a chunk. Well, I guess the simple response would be that there's always going to be something that's transcendent to anything that we can experience or analyze in whatever realm that we happen to be in. There's always going to be something that is a mystery from the perspective of where we are. And so I can't tell you, well, I know what dark matter and dark energy, there's all kinds of theories. But what we used to, I mean, not that long ago, the vacuum was thought of as just being nothing, like empty space. And now we know that in 1 cubic centimeter of space, the potential energy from the quantum vacuum is more than all the energy on the Earth. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So there's so much that we're just incapable of understanding from our limited vantage point. But to me, thank goodness that there's always going to be a mystery there. I think there is never going to be the final theory of physics. Physicists have been through this before with black box radiation, thinking, well, we've got it all wrapped up except for decimal places, and once we understand this, you know, physicists will be more like just engineers. And yes, there comes quantum mechanics going, whoops. And now they're trying to reconcile gravity and relativity theory and quantum physics, and nobody has a clue. There's all kinds of very far out theories about that. But even if they come up with one that's plausible, there's going to be something else that's going to be discovered, because there can't be an end. Remember me talking about Gödel's theorem in the first session? No matter how simple your set of axioms are, if they're at least as complicated as A equals A and A plus B equals B plus A for numbers, there'll always be some statement that you can't prove or disprove. And that was my koan that got me into spirituality. Really, well, wait a minute, it has to either be true or not true. Nope. All you can do is assume it's true, and that's your new system, or assume it's false, and that's your other new system. But it's not, there's not a reality where you can rule out one or the other. It's unknowable. So there always will be an unknowable. And if there weren't an unknowable, then I think the universe would grind to a halt. There'd be no further evolution possible. So thankfully, we don't have that. So I'd like for us to try a practice. This is a very simple practice, but it's one I'd encourage you to work with. So we'll just do it briefly now. So if you believe what the mystics of across traditions pretty much have said, that eventually everything is going to get to, and you can fill in the blank, illumination, enlightenment, or whatever. And in some systems, it'll be thousands and thousands of lifetimes. And other systems, well, it'll be in other realms after the physical realm and after unimaginable lengths of time. But if you believe what they've been saying, and these are some pretty smart beings, that eventually this means you are going to become an illuminated, awakened being. So we'll just take this as a hypothesis. That's all that's required for this exercise, is to assume that that's true. All right, now close your eyes and imagine your illuminated, awakened self at some undefined, perhaps very distant time in the future. And as you imagine your illumined self, if it truly is your illumined self, then you would be in some ways like the Buddha. When the Buddha attained enlightenment, the Buddha became aware of all of his past lives back to insects and one-celled animals and so on, and aware of beings in subtle realms, everything, the whole kit and caboodle. So assume that your illuminated self will have that same capability because he's illuminated or she's illuminated. And now the consciousness of your illuminated self can zero in on you sitting wherever you are on October 1st at about 13 minutes before the hour doing this practice. So you're imagining your illuminated being just focusing, zeroing in his or her consciousness on you at this particular point in space and time. And now Spiritual Light would say, toggle your awareness to yourself sitting here during this webinar. And now you're contemplating your illuminated self in the future, tuning into you. And because it's all you, I mean, it's the same being, you're able to partake of the wisdom of your illuminated self from the future now. You don't have to wait for however long it was before this actually happens. You're kind of bridging these two aspects of your being to the present. And you're becoming present to yourself now with this capacity, same capacity of illumination that you saw in your illuminated self in the future. And from where you sit in the present, now you can expand your awareness to past, long ago, even before this physical incarnation, to the past, also to the future for the rest of your physical existence and beyond this physical life. You can expand your awareness into the subtle realms on which you exist. So now you're encompassing all of this, but kind of the central place of your focus of all this is you right here, right now. You're just experiencing your being as living in all of these realities at the same time. And every part, every moment, these experiences in your existence are an essential part to what has resulted in your illumination. They're all living right now, even though from one vantage point they seem past or they seem future or they seem transcendent. And then just relax and open your eyes. So this was just a sampling of this practice, but you can do this on your own and spend quite a bit more time with it. But I find it can be a very useful practice to help us begin to envision who we really are and the possibilities of who we are and the connections between all the ways that we have and will experience, that they're all happening. It's another thing that the physicists say, that, I mean, all of these different ways that we have of viewing time, it's a conditioning our dualistic consciousness, that we think that time is just this linear process moving from past to present and to future, but it's really just all there. So we have a little bit of time left, so I'd just like to talk about something that the Sufis have talked about for hundreds of years, and what they call the allegory of our soul. This is kind of, and there have been books written by some great beings, Avicenna being one. We describe that it's kind of like his soul's journey, the story of the soul's journey. But each of us is composing all the time the allegory of our own soul, of our own being. And until we free ourselves from our conditioned vantage point, it's like we just have to take what somebody else has written. And what is the somebody else? The somebody else is just external circumstances and programming and so on. But once we wake up from this, we can realize that we can compose the unfolding allegory of our soul, and this isn't pre-assuming what the rest of it's going to look like. It's being open to discoveries of what might emerge, and it's fresh. It's like a surprise when it happens, which makes life much more joyful and exuberant, that we really are unfolding this, and all of us together, everything in this cosmic neural network is unfolding the allegory of the cosmic soul. I mean, the story of, we think of the story of creation, we always think of, well, this is back, it's Genesis or some other religious system, to some being, or somehow the universe came into being. But if you believe this idea of this new creation going on at every instant, that we are become capable of participating in the unfoldment of this new creation. It's kind of a direction that it emerges in, and what we have to contribute to that, and be like a artist. The difference between an artist doing a painting by a paint by numbers, as opposed to an artist that is operating perhaps with an initial idea for what he or she wants to create, but in the process of painting or drawing or sculpting, it could be a musician, could be a dancer, a poet, or whatever. In the process of unfolding that, then some new things become revealed, and it evolves beyond whatever that artist was conceiving of to start with. It might have just started with kind of a germ of an idea, but now it's like a seed. But now the seed has blossomed into something more beautiful than what you imagined or could have imagined that it was going to be. And that's a pretty nice way to have things happen after you get out of bed in the morning. So I want to tell you a little story, because we've all had situations in our life that it seemed like there was no purpose. And then perhaps many years later, we look back and realize if it hadn't been for that situation, something very positive might never have happened in the future. So I want to tell you a story about a little girl when I was in my psychology practice that I saw for, I don't remember if it was for therapy or for testing. And this was a little girl whose brother accidentally shot her with a BB gun when she was 5, and she lost one eye, which is tragic, right? But because of that, she had to go to the ophthalmologist every year to make sure things were okay and healing okay. And when she was 9 years old and went in for a test that she never would have had if none of this had ever happened, if she'd never been shot, they discovered a brain tumor that was diagnosed soon enough that they could remove all of it, and she probably would have died if this had never been discovered. So here, I'm not saying, hey, wonderful, she got shot, but somehow there was something that arose from this tragic situation that you couldn't have foreseen or seen at the time. So when we can find a way to relate to even the most difficult experiences that might happen in our life, and ask ourselves, well, what might be opening in me as a result of my being able to relate and heal from, or deal with what I've had to deal with, and perhaps a radical transformation takes place as a result. So there's always another way of looking at what's going on in our lives. And whenever we get stuck, it can be very helpful just to step back and say, well, what's another possibility here? What's the cosmic neural network seeking to discover by my relating to this circumstance in a way different than what my conditioning would normally have me relate to it as? And when we do that, you know, here's the net with all the knots, but now we've opened, perhaps now there's more space in the net as a result of what we've done. And if it weren't for the knots, there couldn't be any individuality. Well, I'm glad there's individuality. So the knots are not a bad thing. Sometimes the Higgs field is described like it's something that enables matter to have an existence. Something's got to be able to come from the non-manifest into some sort of tangible form. And we can utilize our vehicle, our physical vehicle, and including the awakening of the subtle senses to operate through this cosmic neural network in a way that brings a gift to everything, to our part of it, but also makes something available to the whole system. So I want to thank everyone who has watched this either live or who may watch this at some time in the future. I hope that you've gotten some tidbits that may be beneficial to you in your own spiritual journey. So we just have a couple minutes left if anybody has any last comments that you'd like to share.
Well, I'll just jump in and say thank you, Dr. Don. And again, I appreciate what you have been sharing with us. We're lucky to have you on these live webinars. And uumystics.org. You can find us on the internet or on Facebook, and we look for these kinds of discussions and we delve in the mystery together. And so Dr. Don Weiner, PhD psychologist, retired, UU member, and Sufi teacher. We hope to have you again one of these days. And by all means, keep letting us know about the different classes and kinds of things that you're offering, both in person and over the airways.
Well, thank you for hosting these.
Thank you, Don.
Okay. Well, good night and blessings to all.
Namaste. See you guys.